Africa's National Director of Public Prosecutions, that's Advocate Shamila Bathohi, is due to hold a briefing tomorrow. That's Monday, on the resignation of Advocate Hermione Cronje as head of the NPA's investigating unit. Her notice of resignation comes at a time when there's growing discontent over the pace of prosecution, especially for state capture cases. Let's talk about this then with Angelo Fick, who's joining us from Johannesburg. Angelo, good to have you on the program as always. So has there been an overreaction, do you think, to the news of Hermione Cronje's resignation?
I think that there is a general attempt to read into current events some kind of future prospect and also some kind of imminent disaster. I think in South Africa, we've been so close to disaster for so long that these kinds of changes, including what could just be a personnel change in the ID when Hermione Cronje leaves, is being given greater significance. But that reaction aside, I do think that people have in South Africa generally been very, very disappointed by what has happened on state capture, that it has now been 3 years since the appointment of this particular directorate and of Hermione Cronje, and they've not really seen public action with the prosecution of significant individuals and a halt to the kind of corruption that this unit was established to not only investigate but also to stop.
And when advocates Batohi first and then Cronje came in, and there was the establishment of this unit, it was hailed really as the second coming of the Scorpions. So any concern about leadership instability would invariably cause some dent in public confidence.
Well, I think public confidence in the governance of the majority party, the African National Congress, has really been shown in the last election to not be very strong, particularly among urban people in South Africa. And my sense is that people's everyday experience of the judicial system needs to be taken into account. And therefore, when we talk about confidence in the prosecuting authority, really there's very little to test here because there's been so little by way of public prosecution of prominent officials. None of the officials that have been implicated through interministerial reports and other forms of investigation in the kind of corruption around the PPE scandal during the pandemic, the diversion of funds from the special grant system or other forms of relief, food packages, none of those people have been publicly profiled as having been prosecuted. And so for many South Africans in the 20 months since lockdown alone, the kind of priority crimes that you would have thought would have seen in, an intervention, we haven't seen those kinds of interventions. And if you go back 11 years to the Football World Cup, the 2010 World Cup, we had instant courts for people who violated copyright exclusions at stadiums within sort of an hour of being arrested. They were charged and 5 hours later imprisoned. Now, one doesn't want that kind of instant justice here, but you do want to see, greater progress than we have seen in the 30 or so months since this issue was first supposedly addressed by the new dawn of Cyril Ramaphosa's administration.
You mentioned a loss in the ANC, a loss of support or confidence in the political leadership of the country, but there is arguably a lot more at stake when a citizenry loses confidence in a body as crucial as the prosecuting authority.
So here again, the rumors that one reads in the newspapers and in other forms of publications are about, people blocking this, but and not having support inside the institution. But we'll wait for Advocate Batohi and Advocate Cronje to clarify her reasons for leaving and back up what it is that they say should not be a loss of confidence. But the concern that one ought to have here is that, the policy that the president of the country defended at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, which is cadre deployment, means that so many of these institutions, including the institutions around public prosecutions and corruption battling, are populated with cadres, with members inside the party. And if there are concerns inside the party, as we've seen, internal splits, faction fights that have even affected the party's ability to fight elections, it's very difficult to imagine that these faction fights have not infiltrated the very organs of state that the party says it deployed its cadres to in order to get better governance. If there is the kind of crisis that we see inside these institutions, and we've seen them elsewhere, it is no surprise if people are losing confidence in the party, that the party's internal issues should also begin to affect organs of state. And this, I think, is what Mampele Rampele was referring to 15 years ago when she said we really ought to have a professionalized public service that really is separated from party membership. And this idea of cadre deployment is more destructive than it is, constructive.
I wonder if there is an ultimate metric by which we can measure the success, the stability of a prosecuting authority, or if it's a combination of things.
Well, I don't think that there is an ultimate criterion, but one of the criteria should be if there is rampant corruption reporting, and people reporting this not just in newspapers, but in people's everyday experience, and we've seen the amounts of monies lost, surely there should be prosecutions that follow this in the court systems. Now, we know that the court systems can be slow, but that some of these prosecutions haven't even begun more than 18 months after they were first reported on is really worrying, because most people who experience the criminal justice system do not find that 18 months follow from their, being accused of stealing bread in a supermarket to their being sentenced in a magistrate's court. Why are these? Simply because it involves high-profile people, or it involves people who have access to power and networks inside the government and inside the governing party, may explain some of the very slow processes that we've seen around these prosecutions. If money has been diverted, as we saw in the Digital Vibe scandal, as we saw in the PPE scandal, why are the people who were involved in those, whether they were lowly public servants or whether they were in the ministerial offices, why have they not been charged? And why have the recommendations of interministerial committees and other forms of investigative committees not been followed in the case of the, for example, Eastern Cape Premier, or in the Minister of Health, the former Minister of Health, Zweli Mkhize? These are questions that ordinary citizens have the right to ask, and that Advocate Batohi and all of her senior staff members have to be answerable to. And the fact that Parliament hasn't followed up on this is another form of failure. Too much has been vested inside one stable, which is the consequence of cadre deployment. The idea that the president says, well, this is the norm in OECD countries. Well, the norm in many OECD countries has become rampant corruption. We don't want to follow norms simply because they're international norms. We are a country with a specific history that wants to, not exceptionally, but actually, as a matter of principle, not simply repeat standards because they are international standards. There are local causes for concern. We cannot waste another 10 years lost to further corruption and lack of political will to follow up, because of the cost that such follow-up will have for a governing party, or for what is increasingly a party that has, no longer enjoys the kind of majority that it used to in the 1990s and early 2000s. And that, I think, is something that is a test for all South Africans. Are we married to principle, or are we married to personalities? Do we want to protect the people in power, or do we want to protect the system that allows for us to govern and to live lives in a democratic and accountable, transparent society?
You speak about marrying. We often marry officers, their success and their failures, to particular personalities. Can we get past that point, and should we, as a country, where we assess the success of an NPA, for example, outside of who the incumbent is or was?
Absolutely. This should not simply be, something that Advocate Batohi has to answer for. She has to answer specific kinds of questions as the head of that institution. But the institution itself should be able to answer certain questions as well, and the accountability through Parliament has to remain there. This idea that we have, to use popular parlance, a head honcho in the form of President Cyril Ramaphosa, and that somehow, the really banal phrase that came from inside the ANC to begin with, that the fish rots from the head. You can have, all sorts of other issues wrong in the body politic that do not necessarily come from the head. And simply changing the head doesn't change the body politic. We've seen a change of head in the change of Cyril Ramaphosa in February 2018, and we haven't necessarily seen a change in the body politic. And that means that we have to start addressing, as Njabulo Ndebele, and I keep repeating this phrase of his endlessly, that we can't just keep looking to who is corrupt, what officials are corrupt. We have to start looking at the conditions that make corruptibility possible. And that means asking tougher questions than we do in the soap operification of South African political life, which is we look at villains and heroes, and we don't ever ask questions of why is it that so-called heroes can so easily become villains. because the system allows it, because the system of patronage and the long history of, interpersonal relations fueling political relations that is the hallmark of the ANC and is becoming the hallmark of the Democratic Alliance, why those are not addressed.
Angelo Fick, always good to speak to you. Angelo is with ASRI, an academic and political commentator, as well as analyst. Grateful for your time as always, Angelo. Thank you.